please welcome Peter Sandeman to talk to us on voluntary assisted dying.
I was trying to work out earlier whether the earliest familiar face in this audience, and Kathy, of course, is a member of the Emmanuel home group that has been going for 23 years since Emmanuel ceased to be a parish. But also Gay Gardner inveigled me into working in the Abbeyfield area, as you know, Gay does, inveigle you to do things. And I can't remember how long ago that was, but it was a fair while ago, wasn't it, Gay? And of course, Jeff Oak was, probably still is, a mischievous priest in the diocese when I was registrar, and you have to keep an eye on these mischievous priests. Now, thank you very much for inviting me along. I did make the mistake of telling Peter that I was doing some writing on this topic, so of course he jumped at the chance. Since then, I've also written on the issue of legalisation of sex work, and that was in the Advertiser a couple of weeks ago, and that's produced a satisfactory reaction from people disagreeing and advancing alternate models. These are difficult issues for everybody. They're difficult issues for the church in particular, because as a church, the Anglican Church needs to recognise gone are the days that we actually spoke with authority, gone are the days in which we could expect the parliamentarians to adhere to whatever the bishop or archbishop was saying. And so we need to have a humbler profile, but we also need to be able to speak out and to tackle these issues, but to do so in a way that the general public can understand. So I try and write in a kind of common sense way while having a little bit of a theological underpinning. Now, I do need to issue a first warning. There'll be several during this talk, but the first warning is this is not the official line of the church. And I've got, I think, a relatively good relationship with the Archbishop, but on this one, he and I very firmly disagree. So I'm advancing heresy at the moment, so undoubtedly, Jeff, you'll have to actually preach for a couple of Sundays to correct the record here at St Chad's, yes. Okay, so I too would like to acknowledge the Gardner people as the custodians of the land on which we meet, which has never been ceded. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and our hope that we might walk together in harmony in accordance with the statement from the heart in the spirit of Makarrata. Now, the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill passed the last hurdle of a late amendment in the House of Assembly and the reconsideration of the bill by the Legislative Council, which was designed to ensure that residents of retirement villages are enabled to access voluntary assisted dying despite the policies of the proprietors. And that amendment was actually inserted by Stephen Wade, our Minister of Health, who was concerned that to make sure that people live in the long term in residential settings, many of which are run by church-related agencies, that they would have access to the rights under the bill. And so Stephen moved those amendments. And here it is. This is the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act, and it is very similar to the Queensland and Victorian legislation. There are a couple of differences, and I think that's what we'll find as these debates reverberate around the state parliaments. People will find additional safeguards and refinements as the debate is slightly different in every state. A second warning is that, of course, these issues are the subject of strongly held views and deal with situations which many of us have had to face, or perhaps are facing now, or anticipate facing in the future. So if what I'm saying or somebody else says this evening is of concern to you and upsets you, please feel free to indicate that, particularly if I do, to me or the group, and feel free to absent yourself and have a bit of quiet time, because these are matters close to the heart, and all of us, I think, have had experience of some sort with the fraught issues of death and dying. But before I get to the bill itself, or the Act as it now is, and the specific provisions for voluntary assisted dying, I'd like to set the scene by exploring the traditional perspectives that the Church has held on euthanasia. Often these types of statements start off with a series of definitions which establish some fine distinctions between what is and what is not euthanasia. And I think sometimes these opening statements are used to skew the debate in a particular direction. But I'll try and be as neutral as possible, and I'm at risk now of teaching you how to suck eggs. So if I'm dealing with matters to which you're familiar, please forgive me. But I think we all need to be on the same foundation here this evening. So it's useful, I think, to locate voluntary assisted dying within the broader range of euthanasia-type interventions and the broader debate around euthanasia, which has been going for many years. Euthanasia is derived from two Greek words, eu meaning easy, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing this correctly for any Greek scholars in the audience tonight, eu meaning easy, and thanos, which means death, so easy death. Perhaps the most stringent definition of euthanasia is any action committed or omitted for the purpose of causing or hastening death of a human being after birth, usually for the alleged purpose of ending that person's suffering. Well, I can see that's about the broadest definition that I've seen of euthanasia. The widest definitions of euthanasia include both active euthanasia, in which action is taken for the purpose of causing or hastening death, and passive euthanasia, where action is withheld for the purpose of causing or hastening death. Some Orthodox Christian opponents of euthanasia refer more to action causing euthanasia, or what is termed active euthanasia, rather than the omission of action to prolong life, or passive, or to hasten death, or passive euthanasia. Now, there are a couple of other definitions which may be useful. Voluntary euthanasia is committed with the willing cooperation of the person in accordance with their clearly expressed wishes. Non-voluntary euthanasia is committed where the person is unconscious or cannot give consent. Some authors provide a third level of decision-making, defining involuntary euthanasia as when euthanasia is committed against a person's will. Other writers define involuntary euthanasia as murder and not euthanasia. And some, of course, will argue that all euthanasia is murder or suicide. So often, suicide and euthanasia are conflated or contrasted. Suicide is simply the act of deliberately ending one's own life. Assisted suicide is the provision of the means in order to assist a person to take his or her own life. Physician-assisted suicide is when a doctor provides the means for a person to end their own life. While the doctor may provide a prescription or other means for a person to commit suicide, the patient, and not the doctor, performs the lethal act in suicide. Now, we'll come back to that later in this discussion. Now, while largely agreeing that euthanasia is wrong, the major religions in Australia have some different traditional approaches to the practice of euthanasia. For the Catholic Church, the intent of the action is important. Voluntary killing of an innocent human being, they say, is always wrong. Innocent human being. We'll come back to that as well. Where life-sustaining treatment is withdrawn or withheld with the intent of ending a person's life, this is also considered unethical. Where life-sustaining treatment is withdrawn or withheld with the intent of ending a person's life, this is considered unethical. So intent is very important in the Catholic tradition. Euthanasia by commission or active euthanasia and euthanasia by omission or passive euthanasia are both considered to be wrong. However, and this is where it gets complicated, cessation of treatment is, however, not always wrong, even though the person may shortly pass away as a result. Withdrawal of treatment where the intention is not to hasten death, but rather to withdraw treatment which is futile or overly burdensome, is considered morally justified. Heroic treatment which has little chance of success and is onerous to the patient is therefore not morally justified either. My father, when he was dying of stomach cancer, I had a call from the surgeon who had performed what one might term heroic surgery, apologising to me that he was not able to save my father's life. but completely oblivious to the fact that perhaps that surgery was onerous and unnecessary. But such was the mindset in those days of doing everything humanly possible. The focus on intent is particularly important in the principle of double effect, whereby if the purpose of administering medication in potentially unsafe doses is to alleviate pain, but the patient dies, then that's not considered euthanasia, as the intent was benign. If the action is intended to reduce harm to the patient, then the other unintended effects of sedation and shortening of life are excused. Now that's the dominant view advanced by opponents of euthanasia or voluntary assisted dying, the principle of double effect. An alternative view is that the rightness of the act should be judged on its consequence rather than on the motives, which may often be mixed. One does suspect that a lot of unofficial active euthanasia is conducted by health workers under the protection of the principle of double effect. Now, while this uncertainty is convenient cover for reducing pain and hastening death, I'd argue it would be better to have the rules clarified about the ending of life when pain is intolerable. Now, to come to our own church, the Anglican Church, traditionally euthanasia is opposed by the Anglican Church, and this official view is summarised by Archbishop Philip Aspinall's evidence to the Queensland Parliament in 2019. Philip said, "End-of-life care should ease pain and suffering to the greatest extent possible, short of taking a person's life. That you do not take human life has been a social, legal and moral cornerstone of civilised society. Should this committee recommend legislation providing for voluntary assisted suicide in Queensland, then it's incumbent on the committee to provide a cogent rationale for such a fundamental change." The General Synod of the Anglican Church expressed its own views about euthanasia in a resolution of the 2010 General Synod. This synod affirms the sanctity of life, that life is God's gift, and that our task is to protect, nurture and sustain life to the best of our ability. This synod makes this reaffirmation amidst media reports so soon after a federal election, suggesting a future federal parliamentary debate about euthanasia. Most recently, the Synod of the Diocese of Sydney reiterated its own views in 2016. Recognising that all life is precious in God's sight and that deliberately ending a human life is wrong, Synod views with deep concern the possibility that the Voluntary Euthanasia Bill 2016 may pass the South Australian Parliament shortly. Well, it didn't, but it just has. Further, Synod A rejects the false notion that euthanasia represents dying with dignity. B recognises that euthanasia represents a deep and fundamental change to society's commitment to caring for people at their most vulnerable, and that the elderly in particular will be exposed to possible medical error and abuse. C believes that euthanasia will fundamentally change the doctor-patient relationship by undermining the trust inherent in that bond and the do no harm purpose of medical care. And D supports the maintenance and, if possible, extension of funding available to palliative care units of the South Australian hospitals, and respectfully urges members of the South Australian Parliament to oppose the bill. Now, while not explicit in the Anglican statements, the principle of double effect seems to be the underpinning of the position of the Sydney resolution to deliberately ending a human life is wrong. If the intent was to ease pain and the unintended consequence was to hasten death, then, according to that logic, this would not count as euthanasia. Archbishop Philip's statement, however, seems to exclude the sophistry of the double effect principle. End-of-life care should ease pain and suffering to the greatest extent possible, short of taking a person's life. Now, if this is a correct interpretation of Archbishop Philip's evidence, and I'm not sure that it is, but on the surface it seemed to indicate that, then his position is akin to the Orthodox Jewish approach, in which the life of someone who is terminally ill must be prolonged. Withdrawal of treatment, food or water is not permitted, and any intervention intended to hasten death is murderous. administering morphine to treat pain is permissible despite inevitable impacts on respiration, but, for example, withdrawal of artificial ventilation is not, unless it's clear that the person is brain dead. So as you can see, all sorts of fine distinctions are drawn about the motivation underlying actions aimed to preserve the purity of the intention to sustain life while ignoring the concomitant consequences. Now, in the real world, in circumstances with good palliative care, where pain is not treatable, people do seek a way forward, but until recently, these esoteric divisions have been reified as law that have real consequences for people at the point of death and their families. As I referred to before, my own father had inoperable stomach cancer and was lingering in pain, and he decided to decline water and nutrition, and so he starved himself to death. This was deemed permissible by the hospital, and as a strong Christian, my father was for the most part unafraid of death. In common with many people who have been concerned about voluntary assisted dying and euthanasia, personal experience rather than doctrine shapes my perspective. I'll try to bring both together as we examine this act which has passed our Parliament. But before I do that, there's two more aspects I'd like to briefly cover before we come to the voluntary assisted dying legislation: suicide and disability. As an inaugural member of the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention, I was very much involved in grassroots attempts to prevent suicide, and Anglicare SA, I'm proud to say, has developed the primary postvention service in South Australia. So a lot of the support that is available after somebody attempts suicide is provided by Anglicare, and that's a wonderful service. Of concern to the Premier's Council was the proliferation of websites giving information on how to undertake suicide and the general advocacy of suicide. Sites such as Philip Nishke's Exit International, which promotes euthanasia and advertises methods for suicide, are of particular concern to the suicide prevention movement. The real concern is that the promotion of euthanasia by assisted suicide broadens the acceptability of suicide generally and advances methodologies to the whole population, including people who are depressed or mentally ill. It'll be important, therefore, in enabling any form of euthanasia to ensure there are clear distinctions between what the practice of assisted suicide is when it's acceptable and which is not acceptable when it's not. It's true, however, I believe, that in breaching the absolute sanctity of life, euthanasia does run the risk that ending life prematurely becomes the accepted norm, and the circumstances in which this is permitted will gradually be widened. Since many euthanasia advocates argue in terms of the right to die, this causes suicide prevention movements, especially those who've lost a loved one to suicide, much concern. Now, the second aspect which I think is important to consider is disability, or more particularly the situation of people living with a long-term illness or a physical or mental impairment. Let me try and illustrate this point by reference to the means by which scarce medical resources are allocated according to quality adjusted life years, or QALYs. QALYs is the most widely used approach for estimating the quality of life benefit in economic evaluations. Where do you put your money in the health system? Often you use QALYs to try and guide you in making those investment decisions. In this approach, states of health are assigned a health state preference or utility value on a scale including 1, which is full health, and 0, which is death. Most of us sit somewhere between the two. The amount of time an individual spends in a given health state is then multiplied by the health state preference value to calculate the quality adjusted life years gained by that intervention. The difficulty with the QALYs approach is my ongoing health state may be assigned a low preference value despite my wish to continue living and have the necessary medical interventions funded. Because what to the economists as a low preference value allocated to my condition, I might have a very different personal view. And disability advocates will attack this strongly. In other words, my health state may not be considered worth generally investing in. Now, this becomes especially interested in relation to people with a particular disability, which is accorded a low quality score, so that investment in treatments for people with their condition is accorded a lower priority. Now, I don't want to go down the qualities tangent fully, but if we apply this to euthanasia, if it becomes acceptable for people to end their life in certain circumstances, will this have the flow-on effect of suggesting people in those circumstances have lives that are not worth living? As I've demonstrated, the Christian Church has traditionally opposed euthanasia on the ground that life is a gift from God, and killing an innocent person, including suicide, is wrong. The sixth commandment is accurately translated from the Hebrew as, "Thou shalt not kill," as those of you who are brought up in the King James Version will know. However, the early church changed it to, "You shall not murder." That's the Revised Standard Version. As lawful killing was excused for self-defence, during war, a just war, and as capital punishment. So the sanctity of life, at a very early stage in our church's history, was made conditional on lawful and unlawful killing. And our judgments on these topics have changed over time. So that, for example, capital punishment, which was once lawful, is now unlawful in South Australia, but not so in many of the United States. Whether this exception should now be extended through to the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill was a vexed question for our members of Parliament. Now that this legislation has passed through both houses, it will become operational within 18 months. Now, for some of us, voluntary assisted dying will not be an option we wish to exercise. For many of us, the legislation will thankfully not be necessary or won't be applicable. Nevertheless, the question remains, should voluntary assisted dying be available to those few who would qualify under terms of the Act? A good death, an easy death, is something we would all wish for. Simply not waking up one morning after a full life with a minimum of illness and the opportunity to make peace with those we love, and perhaps make peace with those we don't love. It is true that palliative care will ease pain and suffering for almost all who require relief. However, my experience in aged care is that quality palliative care must be much better resourced and certainly become the norm in aged care. But even if quality palliative care was available in the quantity and quality that we would like, there will remain those whose pain cannot be managed, even with the best palliative care. It's often argued that it's better that some suffer rather than breach the absolute sanctity of life. However, I would argue that the traditional exceptions to this absolute rule already exist. Lawful killing is justified, unlawful killing is not. The question may be reframed as to whether voluntary assisted dying, as currently framed, should be similarly lawful. The legislation passed by our Parliament, now I'm getting to the substance of the bill. The legislation passed by our Parliament restricts voluntary assisted dying to those over 18 years of age who have an incurable illness which will cause death within 6 months and which is causing intolerable pain that cannot be relieved. So it's a very conservative, restrictive approach. For neurodegenerative diseases, the timeline is extended to death within 12 months. Now, I'd like to run through some of the aspects of the bill, and I've got it here in case we actually need to refer to the precise wording. Now, the person making the request for voluntary assisted dying must be assessed to have decision-making capability. The person must have been ordinarily resident in South Australia for at least 12 months. Mental illness and disability in themselves do not qualify a person as eligible for voluntary assisted dying. Health practitioners may not initiate the discussion about voluntary assisted dying, but may provide information on request. Death by voluntary assisted dying is deemed not to be legally suicide. 2 medical practitioners must assess the person as eligible for voluntary assisted dying, and health practitioners have the right to conscientious objection to participate in voluntary assisted dying. Now there's a distinction. Medical practitioners are doctors of medicine, licensed as such. Health practitioners is a broader definition. And both medical and health practitioners have the right to conscientious objection to participate in the process. Now, some of the objection to the draft bill was raised by organisations, church-related organisations, who didn't want to have voluntary assisted dying happening on their premises and on their watch. So health service establishments may refuse to participate in voluntary assisted dying. This is a particular and peculiar amendment moved through the upper house in South Australia, but must ensure the patient is advised prior to their entry to their health service and enable them to transfer to a health service where voluntary assisted dying is available. Colloquially, one might call that the Calvary Hospital Amendment. Importantly, however, and this is really important, the right of refusal does not apply to residential premises as prescribed by regulation, and in particular residential aged care services. So those establishments do not have the right to refuse to participate in voluntary assisted dying or to deny their residents the access. And the thinking was really that in hospital you go in and you go out. So usually your stay in hospital is relatively short. But your stay in a residential aged care facility, or if a younger person with a disability, your stay in the disability residence will be somewhat longer. And so that distinction was drawn, and as I said earlier, that was Stephen Wade in the upper house. If assessed as eligible for voluntary assisted dying by the 2 medical practitioners, a voluntary assisted dying substance may be prescribed to be self-administered or to be administered by the medical practitioner. So you either administer it yourself, or you can apply to have the medical practitioner administer the voluntary assisted dying substance. And there's a number of rules in the Act about what happens to the unused proportion of the substance and what the pharmacist has to do to register the material. Now, my personal view is that the bill provides an acceptable exception to the sanctity of life to enable a good death for the very limited number of people who will die soon and whose pain is intolerable and cannot be relieved. The lingering concern that I think we all would have is the future pressure which may eventuate to widen the scope of assisted dying, the argument to grant dignity, to relieve other forms of suffering, and to give choice. And this is the risk, I think, that requires careful consideration. Having weighed up all these points, and the debate in Parliament was perhaps some of the most dignified debate that has been had in the living history of the South Australian Parliament, in both houses. It was very respectful, and all these points were well canvassed, and the bill passed substantially in both houses.